The Rebel Alliance is nearly always shown as being the protagonists within the Star Wars universe. They fight for freedom and democracy against an autocratic evil empire, and a lot of the time they achieve this noble goal without tarnishing its good guy image. However, what would have happened if the rebellion was more extreme? What if they became so engulfed in this noble goal that they didn't really care about the means, only the end result? An evil rebellion, if you will. Now, obviously, blanketing the rebellion as evil isn't really accurate, but neither is saying that it's solely a force for good. We need to remember that the Rebel Alliance, particularly pre the Galactic Civil War, was fractured. It was made up of many different small groups. And granted, the larger command structure of the Alliance under Mon Mothma was pretty well checked and relatively well behaved. However, there was others, such as those under Saw Gerrera and his partisans, that were far more extremist in their methods to defeat the Empire. Now, as we know, Saw Gerrera and people like him were more or less kicked out of the Rebel Alliance. Saw Gerrera likely following an attack on Inusagi, in which Gerrera and his partisans used flechette launchers, which you can kind of see as being a shrapnel-type shotgun on guests at an Imperial party. This wasn't a military target and resulted in the deaths of many relatively innocent civilians. Now, for this theory, we want to say that Mon Mothma loses power within the larger Rebel Alliance command structure. Perhaps she's arrested. It's no secret that Palpatine and the Empire didn't trust her, and she was eventually labelled a traitor. So we're going to say that maybe Palpatine decides to deal with her a little bit earlier than he did in our own timeline. Ultimately, Mothma is arrested and killed, leaving a power vacuum within the rebellion. With this power vacuum, more extreme elements of the rebellion, similar to Gerrera, it doesn't necessarily have to be him, but we're going to use him for the example, take a harder leadership stance and gain far more control. Now, this is more than likely going to cause huge tears in the rebellion altogether, with huge amounts of soldiers and ships leaving the organisation as they cannot condone the actions of this new leadership. So you are going to be looking at a schism within the Rebel Alliance itself, but we're going to say that the largest part of the Rebel Alliance remains under Gerrera's control. Now, what does this mean for the galaxy? Well, Gerrera's philosophy when it comes to fighting the Empire is basically merciless war. He is a strong believer that when your enemies punch low, you punch much lower. Whilst the rebellion was busy targeting Imperial military complexes and trying to minimalise casualties, Gerrera wanted to spill as much Imperial blood as possible, and that's exactly what will happen with the Rebel Alliance under his control. Essentially, we're looking at a campaign of terror, assassinations on Imperial officials and sympathisers, and it would no longer be enough to simply be neutral on an Imperial-controlled world. If you were seen as even somewhat supporting of the Empire, maybe you're friends with an Imperial official, or maybe even something as simple as a lot of stormtroopers drink at your bar, then the rebellion would see you as an enemy and a target. This would ultimately increase the amount of mindless killings and bombs, being essentially total anarchy wherever the Alliance's eye was caught. When you think about it, legally, the Alliance would be acting far more like a crime syndicate than a freedom-fighting group. Gerrera didn't really care about what was right, and neither would the Alliance under him. He was very much focused on getting what he wanted. Therefore, likely average citizens would be extorted by this new rebellion for resources, or kidnapping to extort ransoms. We're looking at a rebellion with very few rules of conduct, and very little care for what people think about them. It's important to also note here that all of this activity is only going to incur the wrath of the Empire, even more so than before. The Empire deals in absolutes, so if somebody helps the rebels, then they're as good as a rebel. Meanwhile, the rebels would now also be dealing in the same way, so if somebody helps the Empire, or doesn't help them, then they must be aligned with the Empire. However, in my opinion, this rebellion under its new extremist management would not last long at all. You see, all this activity does is justify the Empire's existence. Its rules, its bureaucracy, its massive military and terror tactics. If the rebellion is genuinely killing civilians in a manner of horrific ways, then people are going to think, sure, the Empire's bad, sure it's strict and pretty cruel, but at least it's just trying to keep me safe. The simple fact of the matter is that people knew the Empire, they knew Palpatine, and his Imperial Senate. And this new incredibly aggressive Rebel Alliance is unknown, and it's going to be scary to a lot of people, and that's pretty understandable. To a lot of people, when you mix these rebels' actions along with a lot of Imperial propaganda, it's going to create a pretty uncomfortable image. Remember, a large portion of the rebellion was aliens, and it's only going to highlight the already existing resentment between humans and aliens in the galaxy. And as we know, this anti-alien sentiment is only something that makes the Empire more powerful, and only allows it to get away with far more injustices. What we need to remember here is that people will only remain afraid and compliant for so long. Eventually they will inevitably fight back. However, the Empire can kind of afford to be cruel, at least a lot more than the Rebellion can. They have legions of soldiers, ships, and a massive war machine that can be mobilized when things get tough. So generally speaking, the Imperials could get away with a lot more because they had the power to back themselves. If a bunch of people stand up against the Imperials, it's not really a big deal for them. They'll just mobilize their army and put down any insurgency almost instantly. However, the Rebellion, like it or not, can't do this. The Rebellion is tiny in comparison to the Empire, and that's even in our own timeline, before you even begin to consider the sort of schism that a Guerrera-controlled Rebel Alliance would cause. So realistically, the Rebel Alliance would be even smaller in this timeline. Remember, the Alliance relied on indirect warfare, and much of its funding came from everyday citizens. Many of their safe houses were ran by normal people who didn't like the Empire. You see, as soon as the Rebellion becomes more extremist, and they begin causing more harm than good, then that support is gone. Now, you may be thinking, similarly to the Empire, people will be too afraid of betraying the Rebellion, or refusing their demands. And this is somewhat true, yes. It would be a very, very brave person to tell someone like Saw Gerrera that they can't stay on their property to hide from the Empire. However, again, generally speaking, siding with the rebels over the Empire is a far greater risk. If it's a choice between one evil or another, you're far safer joining the Empire. Sure, betraying the Rebellion may result in a blaster to your back in a few months' time. However, siding with the rebels and betraying the Empire, if the Empire finds out, they'll have you in front of a sham court and executed within an hour. Ultimately, I think it's pretty safe to say that any rebellion that followed the mantra of those similar to Saw Gerrera, extremist and violent, would not be a rebellion that would last very long. The Alliance had to be a force for good. They simply couldn't match the sheer intimidation and cruelty of the Empire even if they wanted to. And without sympathy and quiet support from the people of the galaxy, then they would be hunted down and destroyed by the Imperials. This is likely a reason a lot of resistance cells didn't last very long. Without the support from the general populace, even if it was quiet and not very useful, any insurgencies would have been absolutely wiped out by the Imperials. But what do you guys think? What would have happened if the rebellion went bad, so to speak? And how long do you believe they'd survive? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I really do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, share and sub, as it's really appreciated and it helps the channel grow. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at @TheLawGuy and tick the bell for regular updates when new content comes out. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching. I really do hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.